David Gilmour isn't just a legend, he's the soul inside the quiet between notes. With that black Stratocaster, he sent up the timeless plea of Comfortably Numb and turned the aching lines of Shine on You Crazy Diamond into a sorrow that seems endless. He didn't merely play guitar, he transformed hurt into sound, building vast cathedrals of beauty and grief out of thin air, leaving songs so haunting that millions still fall silent the instant they begin. For decades he was more than a musician. He was a vessel for torment and transcendence, a calm storm whose solos cut deeper than speech. That brilliance wasn't free. He was the friend who watched Syd Barrett drift into illness and distance, the bandmate who stood helpless while Richard Wright faced a cruel disease, and the artist wounded by betrayal, pushed aside by the very band he helped carry through crisis. Those blows could have ended another person. He endured them, turning each wound into music that refuses to fade. And now, at 79, just when peace seemed to have settled after years of storms, a shadow still lingers, leaving millions stunned. What presence continues to follow the quiet genius of Pink Floyd? Take a moment to honor David Gilmour. A simple salute to the man who turned unbearable hurt into some of the most beautiful music humanity knows. Every legend is shaped not only by triumph, but by a hurt too deep to mend. For Gilmour, the hurt began with silence, the kind that marks every note that follows. It's hard to accept that one of rock's most beautiful voices rose not from joy, but from a home where reason outran warmth and dinners passed with little laughter. He was born on March 6, 1946, in Cambridge, England, son of Douglas, a zoologist and university lecturer, and Sylvia, a teacher who later edited film. From the outside, it looked comfortable. A stable, middle-class life in Grantchester, shelves of books, clever talk in every room. But to the quiet boy at the table, it often felt like being unseen. Years later, he described it not as chaos or want, but as a cool indifference that cut deep. He had siblings, yet the sense of belonging slipped away. In those muffled rooms, no one truly listened. At 10, his mother placed a guitar in his hands. Without realizing, she'd just redirected music history. With no teacher, he disappeared into a lamplit room. A boy hunched over strings while the radio crackled. Endless repetition wasn't just practice, it was survival. In a home that didn't speak his language, the guitar became the language that made sense. While other kids shouted at play, David carved emotion into sound, bending strings until they cried. By 13, heavier shadows settled. He was already thinking about mortality. At the Percy School in Cambridge, while classmates battled for grades and cliques, David withdrew. Later, at the Cambridge College of Arts and Technology, fate crossed his path with Syd Barrett and Roger Waters, names that would later be fused with his. But at the time, his world stayed small, anchored to the instrument that had become refuge. Those solitary hours planted seeds, music that would one day quiet entire stadiums. This wasn't a childhood of slammed doors. It was something subtler, and in some ways harsher, a quiet that presses on the soul. In that stillness, he learned endurance. He learned to draw beauty from emptiness, to stretch a single note until it carried more truth than speeches, to turn loneliness into a resonant space. The boy no one fully heard became the man whose guitar could silence oceans of voices. Every real journey begins with struggle. Gilmour's began with hunger. In the early 1960s, while former classmates Barrett and Waters were carving out London's psychedelic underworld, David was scraping by in small bands like Joker's Wild, a gifted player without a permanent stage. He drifted to France with friends, chasing the dream across the continent. The road was merciless. Guitars vanished. Amps were stolen. Money evaporated. Some nights there was only one option: pawn the very instrument that carried his soul, just to eat. In Paris, in roadside cafes and along cobbled streets, strangers walked past while he strummed for coins. To the public, Pink Floyd was rising. To David, Europe was a long road of empty stomachs and blistered fingers. When he finally returned to London, he had nothing. No gear, no band, just a stubborn spark that wouldn't die. Then came a shock worse than hunger. He stepped into a studio where Pink Floyd was recording and saw Syd Barrett, the friend he'd once busked beside, fronting one of Britain's most talked-about bands. But this wasn't the same Syd. His eyes were far away, his speech scattered, his movements unmoored. The visionary who once painted sound in impossible colors had been fractured by heavy drug use and the onset of severe mental illness, symptoms that looked like schizophrenia. Syd barely seemed to know him. The boy David admired was unreachable, and the band Syd built stood at the cliff's edge. In 1967, fate turned again. Pink Floyd asked Gilmour to join, not as a clean replacement, but as a fifth member, a stabilizer, someone to play when Syd could not. For a few unreal shows, 5 men stood on stage, 4 playing, 1 drifting under the lights. David later recalled turning to see Syd with his guitar slack, eyes vacant, as if the spotlight had turned to stone. It couldn't continue. A grim decision followed. On the way to a gig, they simply didn't pick Syd up. That night, David Gilmour became Pink Floyd's lead guitarist. Fans saw a new man in a legend's place. David saw something else, a friend left to illness. He carried that wound for life. Joining Pink Floyd didn't end the turmoil. Without their founding visionary, they were adrift. On stage, David sometimes played with his back to the crowd, overwhelmed, unsure if the music still meant anything. Their first post-Syd album, A Saucerful of Secrets, 1968, was survival more than statement. Keep moving or die as a band. They turned to film work, More, 1969, and Obscured by Clouds, 1972. Not glamorous, but steady and a place to experiment. In those sessions, David refined his voice, the long delays, the aching bends, the seemingly endless sustain. Then, out of the fog, came the breakthrough. In 1971, they recorded Metal and its centerpiece, Echoes, a 23-minute odyssey that filled an entire side of vinyl. 4 men finally breathed as one, sculpting a new identity from chaos. The opening ping of Gilmour's guitar cut through like a lighthouse, and by the end, the music had swelled into a wordless ocean. For the first time since Syd, Pink Floyd had a heartbeat again, and that heartbeat was David's guitar. The 1970s were the years when Gilmour's guitar stopped being an instrument and became a lifeline for a generation. The dark side of the moon arrived, and nothing was the same. His voice rose through, breathe. His solos carved eternity into minutes. His scat entwined with Claire Torrey's wail on The Great Gig in the Sky, and his riff turned the clink of coins into a hymn in Money. It wasn't just an album. It was a phenomenon, lodged on the charts for 15 years, selling in the tens of millions. Pink Floyd jumped from cult to global force. At the center was Gilmour, bending one note until it felt infinite, quieting whole stadiums with a breath. But success couldn't hush the ghosts. Wish You Were Here felt like a memorial. Shine On You, Crazy Diamond opens with 4 desolate notes, each a tear for Syd Barrett, the friend who led them all, now lost to addiction and untreated illness. Gone in mind long before in body. When Gilmour sang the title track, it wasn't performance. It was grief pressed into melody. He admitted it was hard to sing. Every word carried Syd's shadow, silent, unreachable, forever young, forever gone. The fractures widened with animals, where Waters' words dripped anger, while Gilmour's guitar reached for humanity. Then came The Wall, celebrated by the world, lived as a battleground. In the studio, Comfortably Numb was a war zone. Waters pushed for orchestral despair. Gilmour answered with fire. Together they forged one of rock's greatest solos. But the cost was brutal. Rick Wright, David's quiet ally, was forced out during the sessions and reduced to a hired hand on tour. Behind the flying pigs and falling bricks, Gilmour felt the soul of the band slipping away. Even at the height, he later said, "I felt the music losing its meaning." Humiliation followed. The final cut bore Waters' imprint in nearly everything but the name. Gilmour felt like a session player in my own band. Then Waters quit and declared Pink Floyd finished, suing to dissolve the name. Headlines echoed his claim. Overnight, 20 years seemed to vanish, as if the man who had carried their sound had never mattered. It wasn't just professional loss. It felt like erasure. He refused to vanish, Quiet, resolute, he returned to the studio and let his guitar speak. A momentary lapse of reason arrived against the odds, and though critics doubted, stadiums filled. 7 years later came the division bell, with themes of reconciliation, and Wright restored as a partner. The tour grossed hundreds of millions. Pulse preserved the power. At last, the replacement label fell away. Pink Floyd wasn't one man. It was Gilmour, too. Triumph couldn't quiet mortality. In 2005, the classic four, Gilmour, Waters, Wright, Mason, stood shoulder to shoulder one last time at Live 8. Their Comfortably Numb felt like resurrection. For a moment, years melted. Time forgave. The crowd roared like thunder. But behind Gilmour's eyes, a shadow. He knew miracles don't last. 3 years later, the fear became real. Rick Wright was gone to cancer at 65. For Gilmour, it was cruel symmetry. Sid lost to madness. Rick lost to death. The band they built reduced to photographs, recordings, ghosts. It wasn't only the death of a friend, it was the last breath of Pink Floyd's spirit. So came The Endless River, woven from fragments of Wright's playing, a record that felt less like an album than a farewell. Each note was a voice across the divide. To the world music, to Gilmour, a requiem for a brotherhood that could not return. Afterward, he turned inward. His solo work chased not spectacle, but truth. On an Island, 2006, with lyrics by his wife, Polly Sampson, showed a man at peace with both pain and wonder. Rattle That Lock, 2015, carried freedom and exploration, the voice of someone who'd survived every storm. When he returned to Pompeii, where he'd once stood with Floyd, it was alone, closing the circle with grace. His arc is both victory and loss. Stadiums roared, yet silence followed him home. Betrayal marked him, but he kept playing. Friends were lost. He carried their voices through his strings. He turned hunger into grit, guilt into compassion, grief into songs that won't die. The boy who once pawned his guitar to eat became the man who gave the world music that outlives us all. Even now, when the lights dim and the show is over, Gilmour's guitar still cuts the dark, an eternal voice for anyone who's loved, lost, and endured. The cheers could feel immortal. But when the crowd disappeared, a heavier quiet remained. The rifts within Pink Floyd were brutal. Then came a deeper break, the collapse of home. At the same moment the band he had kept afloat was coming apart, his marriage, the place meant to be safe, also unraveled. In 1975, at the band's height, David married Virginia Ginger Hazenbein, a striking American model and artist. The early years glowed. Photos show easy smiles and music-lit futures. For a man raised where love was often muted, marriage promised warmth, a chance to give his children the presents he'd wanted as a boy. 4 children followed. Alice, 1976. Claire, 1979. Sarah, 1981. Matthew, 1986. A home full of noise, racing footsteps. Small hands tugging his sleeves when he returned from tour. He'd later say those years reminded him that something more important than any encore waited at home. But as the 1980s wore on, pressure seeped into everything. The band splintered. His role was questioned. Outside voices painted him as a stand-in rather than a soul. At home, absences stretched, nights into weeks, weeks into months. Ginger, once radiant at his side, grew tired of sharing a husband with the world. The children, still little, asked why he was gone so much. Those questions stung more than any review. He later admitted quietly, "I was watching my marriage dissolve at the same time the band was breaking apart. I don't think I realized until it was too late how much damage was being done." The 1990 divorce wasn't tabloid chaos, but to David, it felt like a private earthquake. He could hold an arena with a single note. He couldn't hold his family together. Friends remember him arriving at sessions looking hollow, carrying the guitar like a weight rather than a gift. The children primarily lived with Ginger. He stayed present, but missed the everyday life, the dinner table laughter, bedtime stories, the simple joy of being there. Ginger later said softly, "We were young. We loved each other, but the world around us was too loud. In the end, it drowned us." For a man whose music drew power from wounds, this was another scar, cut not by a bandmate, but by the collapse of the one place meant for peace. Out of ruins, light can find a way. For Gilmour, that light arrived in the early 1990s with Polly Sampson, a novelist and journalist whose pen held both tenderness and fire. Where the first marriage fell to distance and quiet, Polly became both anchor and spark, not just a companion, but a collaborator, someone who understood that his music wasn't a job, it was survival. With Polly, he reflected, I found not only love, but honesty. She gave me the words when I had none. They married in 1994, as the division bell took shape. To the world, Pink Floyd was releasing another chapter. To David, something more intimate was happening, Polly's words flowing into his melodies, her touch woven into songs like High Hopes. For listeners, it was grandeur and regret. For David, it was also a private dialogue, his wife's message sewn into the band's sound, their home soon filled with warmth. Together they had 4 children, joining the 4 from David's first marriage, making a blended family of 8. A once quiet house echoed with laughter, footsteps, arguments, the rhythm of ordinary days. Visitors saw a different David, the haunted figure replaced by a father on the floor with toys, a husband strumming while Polly scribbled on a notepad. Domestic life, yes, but also alchemy, pain transformed into partnership. Polly has spoken just as plainly. I never felt I was stepping into a legend's shadow. I was stepping into a life, and it was a life we were building together. The ghost didn't vanish. Old wounds. Time missed with the children, who lived mostly with Ginger. But Polly gave him a place where ghosts could be named without swallowing him whole. She became mirror and refuge, a reminder that even great artists need home, warmth, forgiveness. Their creative partnership deepened. On an Island, 2006, topped the UK charts, not with spectacle, but intimacy, songs of peace, reflection, and the quiet victory of getting through. Rattle That Lock, 2015, showed a freer David, still searching, no longer broken, his music steady with Polly's presence through every storm. What makes their story remarkable isn't only the songs, it's the life they built. After decades of chaos and snapping ties, Gilmour found a second chance, not perfection, not escape, but balance. Today, at 79, David Gilmour doesn't live in fame's glare, but in the calm of family. He shares his days with Polly Sampson, his wife since 1994, the partner who has written the words for many of his most intimate songs. Together they raised that blended family of 8. Their children, some like Romany and Gabriel, have joined him on stage, their voices woven into his music. Home isn't a stage now. It's a circle of loved ones, grandchildren at play, evenings in Sussex or aboard the Astoria with Polly nearby and the river sliding past the windows. His fortune, well over $180 million, never turned him into a cartoon rock star. His treasures weren't fleets of limousines. They were rooms where music could breathe and silence could be shaped into song. In 1986, he bought the Astoria, a Victorian wooden houseboat moored permanently on the River Thames, and turned it into one of the world's most storied studios. Glass walls over water. Inside, albums were born, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, The Division Bell, and many solo works. The Astoria isn't just property, it's a floating chapel of sound. In Sussex, he poured himself into restoring Medina House, an 8,000-square-foot Hove seafront landmark, once valued at $15 million, later listed at $10 million, and more recently revalued near $9 million after legal disputes. It wasn't a trophy. It was a retreat, sea air through open windows, music riding the horizon. Beyond England, he kept a Greece villa listed at $1.5 million, Mediterranean light, rare quiet. On land, engines sang. He owned an enviable collection of Ferraris, none more famous than the 1988 Ferrari F40 he and Nick Mason collected at Fiorano, then drove across Europe themselves, 2 friends hammering down highways like kids. The car later stood at the Birmingham Motor Show, and if cars were passion, the sky called louder. Through intrepid aviation, Gilmour restored and flew historic aircraft, P-51 Mustangs, Beach Staggerwings, Boeing Stearmans, Yak 50s and Yak 52s, even a rare SNJ-7C, appearing in more than 80 film and TV productions, including Band of Brothers. These weren't indulgences to him. They were living artifacts, kept with the same reverence he gives guitars, yet for all that wealth, he never let it own him. In 2003, he sold his Little Venice mansion for $3.6 million and gave every penny to Crisis, the homelessness charity. In 2019, he parted with 120 guitars, including the Black Strat, the one that voiced Comfortably Numb and Shine on You Crazy Diamond. It fetched nearly $4 million, the centerpiece of an auction that raised $21.5 million, all donated to Client Earth. Even smaller gestures spoke loudly. $25,000 to save the Rhino in honor of Douglas Adams, who suggested the phrase, the division bell. His message was constant. Property, cars, planes, even guitars, these are temporary. What matters is what they can do for others. My guitars served me well, he said, but it's time for them to serve the planet. He still plays, still sings, still tours. His hair is white, his steps slower. But when his fingers touch strings, time hesitates. A single note stretches like held breath, fragile, endless, whole. He lives quietly now, walking the Sussex coast, tending the garden with the patience he once gave a melody, recording on the Astoria while the river murmurs. Faces age. The sound does not. Time can silver the body. It cannot silence the soul. Around him now is not only quiet, but a delicate symphony. With Polly Sampson, wife, muse, anchor, he's built a life where love itself is collaboration. She writes, he breathes the words into sound. Their children join, Romany's voice trembling through Between 2 Points, Gabriel and Charlie adding their lines. Home isn't just walls, it's a living orchestra. Luck and Strange 2024 isn't merely an album, it's a family portrait in chords and stanzas, a reminder that art's truest power is often found in belonging. On stage, from Rome's Circus Maximus to New York and Los Angeles, he no longer stands alone. He stands in a circle of blood, bond, and memory. But shadows never fully lift. When he turns, only one of the old guard remains. Nick Mason, steady at the kit, not a rival, never an enemy, but a mirror to all that's gone. Sid Barrett, childhood friend, lost to madness. Rick Wright, quiet brother, lost to Ken.